She revolutionised the novel without ever leaving the drawing room. She exposed society's hypocrisies with wit sharp enough to cut through centuries. She created heroines who fought for themselves, heroes who had to earn their goodness, and romances built on intelligence, tension, and truth. She wrote with elegance, precision, and a quiet boldness that reshaped English literature forever. Her books became timeless, adored by readers, studied by scholars, and adapted again and again for every new generation. But behind the beloved stories was a life lived almost entirely in the shadows. A woman navigating strict social constraints, financial insecurity, family obligations, and the limits placed on her simply because she was a woman. She wrote anonymously, earned very little, faced heartbreak, illness, and uncertainty, yet her voice endured where so many vanished. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the sharp, witty, and astonishingly influential life of Jane Austen. Okay guys, welcome back to the Author Files. You're probably listening to this sometime after Christmas Day, because by the time of release, it's actually being released on Boxing Day. So I hope you're all cozy, fed, and sitting comfortably, as today we're travelling back to Regency England, a world of dances, candlelight gossips, and social politics. And we're going to be learning about one quietly brilliant woman, observing it all from the sidelines. Yes, today we're delving into the life of Jane Austen, writer, romantic, realist, and one of the most influential British authors of all time. Her novels have given us unforgettable characters, enduring love stories, and some of the sharpest social commentary that's ever been written, all from a small writing desk in a family home. So settle in beside the Christmas lights, get cozy, and let's explore the life and legacy of Jane Austen, a woman whose words have outlived her by centuries and who still feels wonderfully alive today. Okay, so we're going to do something different for this episode, and that's mainly because not much of Jane's life is actually recorded. There was a whole drama with letters, which we'll discuss later. So to start with, I'm going to talk you through her family, who they were, what they went on to do, and then we will get on to what we do know about Jane's life and, of course, her works. So to kick things off, let's start with the woman herself. So Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire. Jane's father was George Austen. George had studied at St John's College, Oxford, and was ordained in 1755. He was described as a tall, slim, and good-looking man with chestnut brown hair and bright hazel eyes. He was known as the handsome proctor during his time at Oxford, and in 1764 he married Cassandra Lee and took up the duties of rector of Steventon. The fifth child of Reverend Thomas Lee, Cassandra Austen, was born in 1739 and was said to have been writing verses by the age of 6. She was known for being a skilled housekeeper, a fine needlewoman, and a keen gardener. Now, let's look at the children George and Cassandra would go on to have. Let's think of it as a walk through the Austen family tree. So, the first of the Austen children was James Austen. He was born in 1765. He would also go on to study at Oxford University at the age of 14. In 1787, Jane's eldest brother would be ordained. James was said to have been considered the poet of the family, and more than 50 of the poems he wrote survive to this day. When George, his father, decided to retire in 1801, James would take over the running of Steventon and was rector there until his death in 1819. The second child to come along was another son, called George Austen. He was born in 1766, but not much is known about George, because he suffered from some sort of mental disability, and following the customs of the day, George would go to live with a family in a nearby village for the most of his life, along with his uncle Thomas Lee, Cassandra's younger brother, who suffered from a similar disability. 1767 would see the arrival of the Austens' third son, Edward. Edward had a very different and fortunate life compared to his siblings, as when he was 16, he was adopted as the heir to the Knight estates by his distant childless cousin Thomas Knight and his wife Catherine. In 1812, Edward inherited the Knight's estates of Godmersham in Kent and Chawton and Steventon in Hampshire, at which point he changed his surname to Knight in accordance with the terms of the inheritance. He earned £15,000 a year from his investments, making him much richer than Jane's Mr. Darcy ever was. 4 years later would see the arrival of the Austens' fourth son and Jane's favourite brother, Henry Austen. Henry was tall with his father's bright hazel eyes and possessed an irrepressible optimism. He served in the Oxfordshire militia before setting himself up as an army agent and banker. However, when the bank would fail in 1816, he became ordained and remained a clergyman for the rest of his life. 2 years later, in 1773, the Austens' first daughter, whom they named Cassandra, was born. It was said that Jane and Cassandra were best friends throughout their whole lives. When Cassandra was 22, she got engaged to Reverend Tom Fow, but sadly he died on an expedition to the Caribbean, and because of this, Cassandra never married. Cassandra enjoyed reading novels aloud with Jane and would even take care of the household, leaving Jane time to write her stories. A year later, in 1774, the Austens would have another son, this time called Francis, but mainly known as Frank. At the age of 12, Frank would attend the Naval College in Portsmouth. He was considered to have been an excellent young man by an admiral named Nelson, and Frank would later go on to become Admiral of the Fleet, and he was knighted in 1837. In 1775, Jane would be born, but we'll pick up on Jane in just a moment. And finally, in 1779, the Austens would have their final child, another son called Charles Austen. Described by Jane as our own particular little brother, Charles would follow in the footsteps of Frank and begin attending the Naval College in Portsmouth at the age of 12. He would rise to the rank of Rear Admiral, but was said to have not been as serious or ambitious as Frank. In fact, Charles was described as having a sweet temper and an affectionate disposition. So now that we've gone over Jane's family tree, lots of brothers, and of course her older sister Cassandra, let's begin exploring what we do know about Jane's early life. After Jane was born, the winter of 1775 to 1776 was said to have been horrid, resulting in Jane not being christened until the 5th of April 1776, when she was baptised at the local church. Whilst Jane grew up, she would attend church regularly, socialise with friends and neighbours, and read lots of novels, which she would also take pleasure in reading them aloud to her family in the evenings. Jane would also enjoy dancing, often in someone's home, after dinner, or at balls, held regularly at the assembly rooms in the town hall. Her brother Henry would recall that Jane was fond of dancing and excelled in it. In 1783, when Jane was 7, she and her sister Cassandra and their cousin Jane Cooper were sent to Oxford to be educated by Anne Corley, who later that year took the girls to Southampton. The girls were probably sent away to learn because Mrs. Austen, their mother, had a very stressful workload. Not only was she caring for her 5 boys at home, but she also had to look after several boys who lived at the rectory while being tutored by her husband. It is believed that Jane went to Oxford because she couldn't bear to be apart from Cassandra, whom she was absolutely devoted to. When Corley moved house to Southampton, she took the 3 girls with her, and shortly after arriving, Cassandra and Jane became extremely ill, with what was at the time called putrid sore throat, something that today we can deduce as diphtheria. Diphtheria is a potentially fatal contagious bacterial infection that mainly affects the nose and throat. Jane was reportedly very unwell, so unwell that she almost died. For some unexplainable reason, Corley decided that she would make no attempt to inform Mrs. and Mrs. Austen of Jane's condition. Did I just say Mrs. and Mrs. Austen, or It's definitely Mr. and Mrs. Austen, so apologies there. So Corley decided that she would make no attempt to inform Jane's parents about her condition. So like a mini badass, don't mess with me, I'm doing the right thing heroine, their cousin Jane wrote to Mrs. Austen and informed her that Jane's life was in danger. Upon receiving the letter, Mrs. Austen and her sister Mrs. Cooper rushed to Southampton with a herbal remedy that would supposedly cure the infection and rescued their daughters from Corley. The girls would never return to Corley, a decision I wholeheartedly agree with, and when they returned home, they recovered under their mother's care. Sadly, Mrs. Cooper had caught the infection and died shortly afterwards at home, in Bath. This is a crucial point in Jane's life. If Jane Cooper had not sent the letter to Mrs. Austen, many believe that Jane would have died. With Jane and Cassandra not returning to be educated by Corley, the sisters were then home educated. They would be homeschooled until early 1785 when Jane and Cassandra were sent to the Reading Abbey Girls' School, which was run by a Mrs. La Tournelle. It's believed that the curriculum would have included spellings, needlework, French, music, dancing, and drama. Before the December of 1786, Jane and her sister would return home because the school fees for the two of them became too expensive for the Austen family. After 1786, Jane reportedly never again lived anywhere beyond the bounds of her immediate family. After the girls left the Reading Abbey's girls' school, Jane's education would come from reading, often guided by her father and brothers James and Henry. Jane was apparently able to have unlimited access to her father's library and the library of their family friend, Warren Hastings. It's believed that the books contained within these libraries were varied and offered Jane a large collection to choose from. George, Jane's father, would later provide both Jane and Cassandra with expensive paper and other materials for their writing and drawings. And those writing materials provided by her father would become useful as by the age of 11, Jane started to write. Jane would begin to write poems and stories to amuse herself and her family. According to Janet Todd, who is a British academic with particular interest in Jane Austen, Jane would exaggerate mundane details of daily life and parodied common plot devices in stories full of anarchic fantasies of female power, license, illicit behaviour, and general high spirits. From 1787 to 1793, Jane would compile a bunch of drafts which contained 29 early works into 3 bound notebooks which contained 90,000 words. This collection is now known as the Juvenilla, named Volume the First, Volume the Second, and Volume the Third. Scholar Richard Jenkins would describe the Juvenilla as boisterous and anarchic, and would compare them to the works of 18th century novelist Laurence Sterne. Among these works, Jane had written when she was 14, in 1790, a satirical novel in the form of letters titled Love and Friendship, in which she mocked popular novels of Sensibility. In 1791, Jane would write The History of England, a 34-page manuscript which contained 13 watercolour miniatures created by her sister Cassandra. It is speculated by some scholars that after writing Love and Friendship, Jane decided to write for profit to make stories her central effort, with the hopes of becoming a professional writer. In the August of 1792, Jane would begin working on a story titled Catherine, or The Bower, but was left unfinished until picked up again in Jane's Lady Susan. A year later, in 1793, Jane would craft a short play which she titled Sir Charles Grandison, or The Happy Man, a comedy which would be delivered across 6 acts. She wouldn't finish this until 1800. Jane would turn 18 in 1793 and would begin working on longer, more sophisticated stories. Also in this year, Jane would become an aunt for the first time. It is believed that she sent her newborn niece Fanny Catherine Austen Knight 5 short pieces of the Juvenile, which are now known collectively as scraps, which were purportedly her opinions and admonitions on the conduct of young women. I literally cannot say that word, so my apologies. When her second niece was born in the same year, who was called Jane Anna Elizabeth Austen, Jane would write 2 more miscellaneous morsels, dedicating them to Anna on the 2nd of June 1793, writing, "Convinced that if you are seriously attend to them, you will derive from them very important instructions with regard to your conduct in life." There is evidence that Jane continued work on these pieces as late as 1811, when she was 36, and that her niece and nephew Anna and James Edward Austen made further additions as late as 1814. Between the age of 18 and 20, Jane would work on the before-mentioned Lady Susan. Lady Susan is a short epistolary novel, a novel told through the series of letters, and is often referred to as Jane's earliest attempt at writing a sophisticated and ambitious story. A biographer of Austen's, Claire Tomalin, describes the novella's heroine as a sexual predator who uses her intelligence and charm to manipulate, betray, and abuse her lovers, friends, and family. According to some sources, it is believed that Jane based the character on Eliza de Feuillade. I have probably butchered that as well. Who married Jane's brother in Henry in 1797. So I did actually look up how to pronounce Eliza's full name, but for some reason I just can't quite grasp her surname. So from this point on, when she's mentioned, I'm going to be super lazy and just say Eliza. So Henry married Eliza in 1797. But before meeting Henry, Eliza's first husband was guillotined in 1794 during the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. It is believed that Eliza would tell Jane stories of her glamorous life and various adventures. So that's everything we know about Jane's life up until she was 20. Like I said at the start, not much is actually chronicled, and that's because of a whole drama and mystery with letters, which we'll discuss towards the end of the episode. But for now, let's explore one of Jane's early romantic adventures. Between December 1795 and January 1796, a young man visited Steventon after finishing a university degree in law. The young man would make stop for a short while in Steventon before moving to London to train as a barrister, and that young man was called Tom Lefroy. Shortly after Jane turned 20, Tom and Jane would meet, and it is assumed that they met at a ball or some other social gathering in the town. And we can see from one of Jane's letters to Cassandra that the pair of them had spent a good amount of time together. In the letter, Jane said, "I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together." After their meeting, Jane would write letters to Cassandra, and they would show how conflicted she was about liking the young Tom. In one letter, Jane described Tom as a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, and 5 days later, she would write that she had expected an offer from her friend, and that she shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat, and would further say, "I will confide myself in the future to Mr. Tom Lefroy, for whom I don't give a sixpence, and refuse all others." And so what did Jane mean by give away his white coat? Well, the white coat is a reference to Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, which Tom reportedly admired. It was a racy novel for a couple to discuss on the dance floor, which would suggest intimacy might have occurred. If Jane was under the notion that her relationship with Tom would develop, she would be disappointed, as the next day she wrote, and I just love the drama and of these words. So in this letter, she wrote, "At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Leroy, and when you receive this it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea." Oh, Jane. It is said that the Leroy family intervened and sent Tom away to London, as they believed marriage was impractical. Neither Jane or Tom had any money, and Tom was dependent on his great uncle in Ireland, who was financing his education. Jane would never see Tom again. However, in the November of 1798, Tom was still quite clearly on Jane's mind. As in another letter to Cassandra, Jane would say that she had had tea with one of his relatives and that she wanted so desperately to ask after him, but could not bring herself to raise the subject. In 1855, an elderly Tom would admit that he had been in love with Jane, saying it was boyish love. So now that we've discussed Jane's very early and one of her only romances, let's talk about her early manuscripts. So just before we get started, it can become a little bit confusing because before the books that we know today as Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, at the time Jane was penning these, they actually had different titles. So bear with me and let's pick up on her early manuscripts. So sometime before 1796, Jane would read her first full-length novel titled Eleanor and Marianne out aloud to her family. The novel was told through a series of letters, however, with no surviving manuscript ever found, there is no way to know how much of the original story remained when the novel was published anonymously in 1811 as Sense and Sensibility. 21-year-old Jane would begin working on her second novel in 1796, titled First Impressions. In the August of that year, she had finished the first draft, and like with all of her stories, she read it out aloud to her family. In the November of 1797, George, Jane's father, would do something that Jane may or may not have known about. He attempted to get First Impressions published by writing to an established publisher in London called Thomas Cadell. He had asked Cadell if he would consider publishing First Impressions. However, Cadell would return George's letter, marking it declined by return of post. When Jane was happy with First Impressions, she returned to work on Eleanor and Marianne, Sense and Sensibility. From November 1797 until mid-1798, Jane would work on the novel by reframing it to be told by third-person narration. By the way, First Impressions would later be published as Pride and Prejudice. Also in 1797, Jane would meet Eliza, who we mentioned earlier, the woman who would become Jane's brother's Henry's wife. Eliza would recall the tragic execution of her previous husband to Jane, which reportedly left Jane with an intense fear of the French Revolution that lasted for the rest of her life. In mid-1798, Jane would begin writing a third novel that had the working title of Susan. She would finish Susan a year later, and in 1803, Henry Austen would offer Susan to a London publisher called Benjamin Crosby, who paid £10 for the copyright. Crosby would promise speedy publication and would advertise the book publicly as being in the press, but took the novel no further. Susan, which would later be titled Northanger Abbey, would remain in the hands of Crosby until 1816, when Jane brought the copyright back from him. The next decade would bring some major changes, not just for Jane, but for the whole Austen family. And here begins the Bath era of Jane's life. In the December of 1800, George Austen unexpectedly announced his decision to retire from the ministry. He decided to leave Steventon and move his family to Bath, where they resided at 4 Sydney Palace. Jane was said to have been in shock at the thought of moving away from the only home she had ever known, although the travel was good for her parents. Jane's time in Bath is interesting as she wasn't as productive with her writing as she had been while living at Steventon. It is known that she made some revisions to Susan, Northanger Abbey, and she began and then abandoned work on a new novel that was titled The Watsons. Claire Tomlin, a biographer of Jane Austen, suggests that her decrease in productivity reflects a deep depression, disabling her as a writer, whereas fellow biographer Park Honan, who released his biography of Jane Austen in 1987, disagreed, arguing that Jane wrote or revised her manuscripts throughout her creative life, except for a few months after her father died. Jane's lack of writing during this period could also be explained by her social activities whilst in Bath, which took her time away from writing novels. A critic of Jane's, Robert Irvine, would suggest that if Jane spent more time writing novels when she was in the countryside, it might have been because she had more spare time. Irvine would also say that Jane moved and travelled all over southern England during this time, resulting in Jane not having the best environment to write a long novel. We don't actually know much about what Jane got up to between the years of 1801 and 1804, because Cassandra did something to cause this, but more on that later. What we do know, though, is that in 1802, Jane would receive her only ever offer of marriage from a man named Harris Big River. Jane met Harris when, along with her sister Cassandra, they went to visit Alethea and Catherine Bigg, who were old friends of theirs who lived near Basingstoke. Harris had just finished his education at Oxford, so was at home with his sisters at the time of Jane and Cassandra's visit. But what was Harris like? Well, according to Caroline Austen, Jane's niece, Harris was said to have been a large, plain-looking man who spoke very little, and when he did speak, he apparently stuttered. He was also said to have been aggressive in conversation and almost completely tactless. It's believed that Jane contemplated his proposal because they had known each other since they were young, and marrying Harris would have provided practical advantages to both Jane and her family. If she had married him, she would have been able to have provided her parents with a comfortable old age, give Cassandra a permanent home, and maybe even assist her brothers in their careers. Critic Irvine described Harris as somebody who seems to have been a man very hard to like, let alone love. And as you've probably guessed by now, Jane did not end up marrying Harris. The next morning, after accepting his proposal, she realised she had made a mistake and withdrew her acceptance. And then, unfortunately, on the 21st of January 1805, Jane's father George would pass away suddenly. And just to cover myself, because I've seen various sources that suggest a different date of death in January, the majority I have come across state that he did pass away on the 21st. It is also believed that he died of natural causes. With her father's passing, Jane, Cassandra, and their mother were left in a tricky financial situation. But to solve this, Jane's brothers would come to the rescue. Edward, James, Henry, and Frank pledged to make annual contributions to support their mother and sisters. Over the next 4 years, the Austens' living arrangements would often reflect their financial insecurities. For some of the time, they would remain in their rented quarters in Bath. In June 1805, they would visit Steventon and Godmersham. In the autumn months, they would move to Worthing, a seaside resort, where they would stay at Stamford Cottage. It is during Jane's time at Stamford Cottage that it is believed she finished the final copy of Lady Susan and added the final pages. In 1806, Jane, her sister, and her mother would spend time visiting different members of the family and moved to Southampton, where they stayed with Frank and his new wife. Now, do you remember the publisher Richard Crosby that I mentioned earlier? Well, on the 5th of April 1809, Jane wrote an angry letter to Crosby, offering him a new manuscript of Lady Susan if he chose to publish it immediately. Jane would also request a return of the original manuscript. According to sources, though, Crosby replied by saying that he had not agreed to publish a novel by any specific time, and that Jane could purchase the copyright for Lady Susan for £10, what he had paid, and find another publisher. But unfortunately, at this point, Jane's financial situation put her in a position where she could not buy back the copyright. Also in 1809, Jane's brother Edward offered Jane, Cassandra, and their mother the use of a large cottage in Shorton village. So in the July of that year, the three of them moved in and began to live a much quieter life. Jane, Cassandra, and their mother would rarely socialise with gentry, and they only entertained whenever family visited. A good insight to their time at Chawton College comes from Jane's niece Anna, who described the family's life there as a very quiet life, according to our ideas. But they were great readers, and besides the housekeeping, our aunts occupied themselves in working with the poor and in teaching some girl or boy to read or write. Over the next couple of years, Jane would finally become a published author, and her 6 novels would be released into the world. Like many female writers of her time, Jane would publish her novels anonymously. Back then, society expected women to focus on being wives and mothers, and writing was seen at best as a pleasant little side activity. If a woman wanted to write full time, it was thought to somehow undermine her femininity. So to keep up appearances, books by women were often published without their names on the cover. It allowed people to pretend the author wasn't aiming to become what they called a literary lioness, basically a female celebrity in the literary world. There was another reason too. The novel itself wasn't taken very seriously. Poetry was considered the true respectable art form, and poets, men and women, nearly always put their name on their work. But novels were viewed as a bit more lower tier, so lots of early novelists like Jane chose to stay anonymous, regardless of gender. While living at Chawton, Jane published 4 novels, all of which were generally well received. Thanks to her brother Henry, her first publisher, Thomas Edgerton, agreed to take on Sense and Sensibility. Like all of Jane's books, except Pride and Prejudice, it was published on commission. Now, publishing on commission basically meant that the author took on the financial risk. The publisher fronted the money to print the book, then paid themselves back as copies were sold. After that, they would take a 10% cut out of each sale, and whatever was left went to the author, Jane in our case. But there's the catch. If the book didn't make enough to cover its production costs, the author had to pay the difference. There was a third option, publishing by subscription, where readers promised to buy the book in advance, but that only worked if you were already famous or had a powerful aristocratic patron promoting you, and Jane had neither. Sense and Sensibility finally appeared in October 1811, credited simply as by a lady. And because it was sold on commission, Edgerton didn't skimp. He used expensive paper and priced it at 15 shillings, which in today's money is roughly around £69. The reviews were positive, and Sense and Sensibility quickly became popular with young aristocrats, the trendsetters of the day. The entire first edition had sold out by the middle of 1813. What's interesting is that Jane's novels were printed in much larger quantities than was normal for the time. The reading public for novels was fairly small, and producing books by hand, especially with expensive handmade paper, was costly. So most novels were printed in editions of 500 copies or fewer, just to limit the financial risk for both the publishers and the authors. Even bestsellers of the era rarely exceeded 750 or 800 copies in their first run. If demand stayed strong, they'd simply print more later. Jane's novels, though, broke that pattern. Her print runs ranged from around 750 copies of Sense and Sensibility to roughly 2,000 copies of Emma, a huge leap compared with the norm. It's unclear whether this decision from Jane herself or from her publishers, because most of her books were published on commission. She, and later her sister Cassandra, carried most of the financial risk. That meant publishers could be a bit braver with larger print runs since it wasn't their money on the line. By contrast, popular non-fiction books often saw much bigger editions right from the start. Jane earned £140 from Sense and Sensibility, which is roughly £12,800 today, and it gave her not just a bit of financial security, but also a real sense of independence. After its success, all of her future books were promoted simply as being by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Her name never actually appeared on any of her novels during her lifetime. In January 1813, Egerton would publish Pride and Prejudice, a reworked version of an earlier manuscript titled First Impressions. Jane sold Egerton the copyright for £110, roughly about £9,100 in today's money. And to maximise profit, Egerton kept production costs down by using cheaper paper and priced the book at 18 shillings, around £74 today. He pushed the book hard with advertising, and it paid off. Pride and Prejudice was an instant hit, earning glowing reviews and selling strongly. Interestingly, if Jane had published it on commission rather than selling the copyright, she would have made around £475 in profit, which would have been roughly twice her father's yearly income during his lifetime. By October that same year, Egerton was already selling a second edition of Pride and Prejudice. Then, in May 1814, he published Mansfield Park. Critics didn't pay much attention to Mansfield Park, but Jane's loyal readers loved it. The entire print run sold out within 6 months, and Jane earned more from that novel than from any of her others. Without Jane's knowledge or consent, her novels were translated into French, and not in the way you might hope. They were published in cheaply made pirated editions across France. Now, the literary critic Noel King pointed out back in 1953 how surprising it was that Jane's novels found a market there at all. At the time, French readers were obsessed with lush romantic fantasies, so Jane's focus on everyday English life was quite a contrast. But here's the kicker. Jane's main French translator, Madame Isabelle de Montelou, barely spoke any English. Rather than true translations, her versions were more like imitations. Montelou relied on assistants to provide summaries of the originals, which she then rewrote into a flowery French style. This often meant the plots and characters were widely changed, sometimes beyond recognition. Now, let's talk about a little juicy story. And I love this story because it shows Jane doing something she absolutely did not want to do. But she had no choice to do it anyway. Because Regency politics were basically one big game of you can't say no. So it was known that Jane could not stand the Prince Regent, or PR as she would call him. And in one of her letters, she bluntly said she hated him, largely because of how appallingly he treated his estranged wife Caroline. He restricted her access to their daughter and behaved terribly in public. The whole thing was a mess, and Jane thought so too. So why on earth did she end up dedicating Emma to him? Well, the answer is she didn't really have a choice. In the autumn of 1815, Jane was in London nursing her brother Henry, who'd fallen seriously ill. One of the doctors treating him just happened to be the Prince Regent's personal physician, and this doctor, clearly a fan of literature, realised that Henry's sister was the author of Pride and Prejudice. He practically lit up and immediately announced that the prince was a huge admirer of her novels. Apparently, he kept a full set at every one of his residences, very on brand for a man with too many houses. And then he went a step further. Much to Jane's horror, the doctor informed the prince that she was currently in London. The prince, who never turned down a chance to show off, promptly ordered his librarian, James Clark, to invite Jane to Carlton House so he could show her the library and all of his fancy apartments. Now, Jane was no fan of royalty, but she wasn't about to snub a direct summons from the future king, so she went. And while she was there, James Clark delivered the news. The Prince Regent wished her to know she was at liberty to dedicate any of her future novels to him. Now, that phrase, at liberty, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's basically Regency speak for this isn't optional. Jane initially resisted. She had zero desire to dedicate anything to a man she despised, but likely thanks to her brother Henry, who understood that publicly refusing the future monarch was a spectacularly bad idea, she eventually accepted the inevitable. So reluctantly, and probably with an eye roll that could be heard across London, Jane asked her publisher to dedicate Emma to the Prince Regent, a dedication she did not want, to a man she did not respect, because sometimes even Jane Austen couldn't avoid falling in line. In mid-1815, Jane switched publishers, moving from Egerton to John Murray, a bigger name in London publishing. Murray released Emma in December that year, followed by a second edition of Mansfield Park in February 1816. Emma performed very well, but unfortunately, the new Mansfield Park edition didn't sell, wiping out much of the money made from Emma. These were the last novels Jane saw published while she was still alive. While Emma was being prepared for print, Jane started working on the Elliots, what we now know as Persuasion. She had finished the first draft by July of 1816. Around the same time, her brother Henry brought back the copyright for Susan from Crosby, but Jane had to put both Persuasion and Susan on hold because of family money troubles. Henry's bank collapsed in March 1816, wiping out his assets and plunging him into deep debt. This hit not just Henry, but also Jane's brothers, Edward, James, and Frank, who also lost significant sums. With Henry and Frank no longer able to help financially, the whole family felt the pinch, and Jane's publishing plans had to wait. By early 1816, Jane would start to become feeling unwell, but like many of us, she ignored the warning signs. By the mid-year, though, it was clear her health was seriously declining. She began a slow, uneven deterioration that would later end her life. Most biographers agree with a diagnosis made back in 1964 by Zachary Cope that Jane likely died of Addison's disease. However, some think it might have been Hodgkin's lymphoma instead. To make matters worse, when Jane's uncle died, he left his entire fortune to his wife, effectively disinheriting the rest of the Austen family. This upset Jane deeply, and she wrote, "I am ashamed to say that the shock of my uncle's will brought on a relapse, but a weak body must excuse weak nerves." Despite her illness, Jane would keep writing. Not happy with the original ending of the Elliots, which we now know as Persuasion, she rewrote the final 2 chapters, finishing them on the 6th of August, 1816. Then, in January 1817, Jane started a new novel called The Brothers, which would later be published as Sanditon in 1925. She managed 12 chapters before having to stop in mid-March, probably because of her worsening health. Interestingly, Sanditon's heroine, Diana Parker, is described as an energetic invalid. Jane poked a bit of fun at hypochondriacs in the story. She even called Diana bilious, and just 5 days after giving up on the novel, Jane wrote about herself saying she was turning every wrong colour and spending most of her time chiefly on the sofa. And then, on the 18th of March, 1817, she would note that she had finally put down her pen for good. Jane would often downplay her illness, joking that it was just bile and rheumatism. But as time went on, it became clear things were much worse. She struggled to walk and had almost no energy. And by mid-April, she was confined to bed. In May, her brother Henry and sister Cassandra took Jane to Winchester for treatment. However, by this point, it was way too late. Jane was in terrible pain and sadly seemed ready to welcome death. Jane Austen passed away in Winchester on the 18th of July 1817, aged just 41. Thanks to Henry's connections in the church, she was buried in the north aisle of the nave at Winchester Cathedral. Her brother James wrote her epitaph, but interestingly, it did not mention her achievements as a writer. The epitaph reads, "In memory of Jane Austen, youngest daughter of the late Reverend George Austen, formerly rector of Steventon in this county. She departed this life on the 18th of July 1817, aged 41, after a long illness, supported with the patience and hopes of a Christian. The benevolence of her heart, the sweetness of her temper, and the extraordinary endowments of her mind obtained the regard of all who knew her, and the warmest love of her intimate connections. Their grief is in proportion to their affection. They know their loss to be irreparable, but in their deepest affliction they are consoled by a firm, though humble hope that her charity, devotion, faith, and purity have rendered her sole acceptance in the sight of her Redeemer. In the months following Jane's death, her sister Cassandra and her brother Henry, along with publisher John Murray, arranged to publish Persuasion and Northanger Abbey together as a set. Henry would also write a biographical note in December 1817, the first time anyone publicly revealed that Jane was the author of these beloved novels. Literary biographer Claire Tomalin calls it a loving and polished eulogy. Sales of this set would go well for the first year of its release, with only 321 copies left unsold by the end of 1818. Even though Jane's 6 novels were out of print in England during the 1820s, people kept reading them through private and circulating libraries. Jane had early admirers too. One of the first fictional stories to feature Jane herself appeared in 1823 as a letter to the editor in the Ladies' Magazine. It praised her genius and suggested that aspiring writers were quite jealous of her talent. Then, in 1832, the publisher Richard Bentley bought the remaining copyrights to all of her novels. That winter, he published 5 illustrated volumes as part of his standard novel series. By the October of 1833, Bentley released the very first collected edition of Jane's works, and since then, her novels have never been out of print. So, earlier on in the podcast, I mentioned that we don't know much about Jane's life because of an act her sister made after she had died. Well, let's explore exactly what Cassandra did. So, Jane was a prolific letter writer, like many people back then. In her time, writing letters was how people kept in touch, shared news, gossiped about relatives, and even discussed their own books and ideas. Scholars estimate that Jane probably wrote several thousand letters during her lifetime. And yet today, we only have about 161 surviving letters written by her hand. That's it. Fewer than 200 letters out of what must have once have been thousands. The main reason for this has long been attributed to Jane's older sister Cassandra. After Jane's death in 1817, Cassandra became the guardian of her sister's personal papers. Traditional accounts have said that Cassandra destroyed most of the letters she had received from Jane. But here's the twist. We have no conclusive evidence that Cassandra burned the letters. According to the curators of the Morgan Library Museum's online Jane Austen exhibition, which houses the largest collection of surviving letters written by Jane, it has long been believed that after Jane Austen died, Cassandra destroyed many, if not most, of her sister's letters. However, there is no conclusive evidence that Cassandra did so. In other words, the dramatic story of Cassandra literally burning letters comes from a family memory, not contemporary proof. That memory was first recorded by Jane's niece in 1867, decades after Jane and Cassandra had both died. Their niece claimed that Cassandra had burnt the greater part of Jane's letters 2 or 3 years before her own death. Caroline, Jane's niece's account of this was repeated and embellished by family members in later generations. What is documented is that fewer than 200 letters survive today, and the largest single group of them, 51 letters, is held by the Morgan Library in New York. Many of the surviving letters are ones Jane wrote to Cassandra while they were apart, often daily, sharing domestic news, reflections on books, local gossip, and lively observations of social life. Researchers also know that Cassandra did sometimes censor or edit letters before preserving them. In some surviving letters, the curator knows that sections were cut, probably because they contained personal or unflattering remarks about relatives or candid references to Jane's own health. So while the exact scale of loss is uncertain, the effect is clear. We have a fragmentary picture of Jane Austen's private voice. Witty, personal, keenly observant, but we lack most of what she once wrote. And that has shaped how we understand her life. Without a full correspondence archive, biographers are left piecing together her existence from letters that survive, family recollections, diaries of relatives, and external records. It's easy to imagine that those letters might have offered deeper insight into her thoughts on family dynamics, her feelings about her own writings, her frustrations or fears, even her friendships and loves, things that Jane rarely spelled out in her novels. Instead, we're left with a partial curated view. Part of Jane Austen, the brilliant novelist, part of Jane Austen, the sister and correspondent, and large parts of her private inner life remain unknown. What we do know now, thanks to the letters that survive, is that Jane wrote with warmth, humour, and sharp observation. She described everyday life with vivid intelligence and shared family news with a close-knit circle she trusted. And what we don't know, because so much was lost or possibly destroyed, adds a layer of mystery to the woman behind the books we still read and love today. And in my own personal opinion, back then, the only way people could communicate, if not face to face, was via letters. And to me, I feel like the letters Jane wrote were personal and private, and I don't for one second believe that throughout her lifetime she ever wrote them thinking that one day, if we had found them all, that they would then be, studied and read by people that didn't know her. So I think that although it would be nice to find out more about Jane's life and her thoughts and feelings and whatnot, it would also, I also feel like it's her own privacy, and that's okay. And now I'm done babbling, and we have discovered the story behind Jane's missing letters. Let's look at some other interesting facts about Jane that we did not cover. So let's talk about Bath buns. And before I carry on, Bath is one of those names where some people say Bath, some people say Bath. I'm going to stick with Bath. So while Jane was living in Bath, she developed a real fondness for Bath buns, or buns, B-U-N-N-S, as they were often called at the time. These weren't the little pastries you might picture today. They were big, indulgent, brioche-like cakes served warm and drenched in butter. Total comfort food. Oh my god, they actually sound amazing. And next time I'm in Bath, I'm definitely going to have to try one. The Austens were known to have them for breakfast, which in the Georgian era wasn't until about 10 a.m, and they'd have it alongside tea or coffee. Some bakeries would even deliver the buns warm to their door. Jane definitely had a sweet tooth. In one of her letters to Cassandra, written in June 1808, she jokes about her enthusiasm for a simple treat, writing, "You know how interesting the purchase of a sponge cake is to me. It's such a relatable line, and such a Jane Austen thing to say." Her letters are full of small, vivid references to meals, ingredients, and the rhythm of household life. She clearly enjoyed food, but there was also a practical side to it. Jane played a big role in the managing of the Austen household, helping her mother and sister to keep the family running on a very strict budget. She kept track of food prices, which were constantly shifting during the long years of the war with France, and she even collected recipes for the servants to try. It's a lovely reminder that behind the sharp wit and brilliant novels, she was also a woman deeply involved in the everyday realities of domestic life. Now we move on to a holiday romance. So here's a little story from Jane's life that I absolutely love, partly because it feels like something straight out of one of her own novels. Many years after Jane died, her sister Cassandra finally revealed that Jane once had a brief holiday romance in Devon, back in the summer of 1802. Very on brand for a woman who gave us so many swoon-worthy fictional courtships, don't you think? We don't know the man's name, which somehow makes it even more Austen-esque, but most accounts suggest he was a clergyman. And this wasn't just a passing crush. Their nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, later wrote that Cassandra genuinely believed this man was worthy to possess and likely to win her sister's love. That's high praise from Cassandra, who did not hand out romantic approval lightly. According to the family, when the holiday ended, he made it very clear he intended to see Jane again. Cassandra was convinced he meant to propose. But then comes the heartbreaking twist. They never met again, because he died suddenly not long afterwards. Jane, who seemed to have genuinely connected with him, never married. And here's something to think about. If she had married him, and especially if she'd gone on to have children, her life would have looked completely different. The demands of Georgian domestic life were enormous. Writing was something women squeezed into the margins of their day, often literally hiding their pages when someone walked into the room. It's very possible that had she become a wife and a mother, the novels she wrote later, the last three masterpieces, might never have existed. A bittersweet little footnote to her life, and maybe a reminder of how much of Jane Austen's genius survived because she lived, by circumstance or fate, outside the traditional path expected of women at the time. But maybe Jane's novels were her children. So in her letters to Cassandra, Jane gets wonderfully honest about how she felt towards her books, especially Pride and Prejudice. She actually calls it her darling child, which is such a perfect little window into her personality. And she doesn't stop there. Talking about Sense and Sensibility, she wrote, "I am never too busy to think of S&S. I can more forget it than a mother can forget her sucking child." It's a brilliantly revealing comparison, because for Jane, writing really did function almost like a long, demanding creative pregnancy. These books weren't dashed off. They were laboured over for years. Pride and Prejudice is the perfect example. She first drafted it way back in October 1796, when she was barely into her 20s, and yet it didn't actually make it into print until January 1813. That's a 17-year journey, and to make it even more heartbreaking, the very first publisher she sent it to didn't even bother reading the manuscript before rejecting it. Imagine that, a world-changing novel, casually tossed aside. And when she compares her novels to children, there's a deeper meaning there too. Jane is almost acknowledging that if she'd followed the conventional route expected of women in her social class, marriage, motherhood, running a household, she probably wouldn't have had the time, space, or creative freedom to write it all. The books we cherish today might never have existed. What's interesting is that she never expresses in the letters that still exist regret about not having children of her own. If she did feel those urges privately, she certainly didn't confide them in her surviving correspondence. What we do know is that she adored her many nieces and nephews, as she was a genuinely beloved aunt, the kind who remembered birthdays, encouraged creativity, and stayed closely involved in their lives. In a way, she ended up with a large family after all, just not the traditional one. And before we wrap up, let's take a look at some of Jane's statistics. So in her lifetime, 2,000 copies of Emma in 1815 were printed. This was the largest print run for her works while she was alive. And in 2012, one of these first editions sold for around £200,000 at auction. There have been over 20 million copies of Pride and Prejudice sold since its publication. Jane's novels have been translated into over 40 languages. And since Jane's death, her books were only ever out of print for just 12 years. Jane Austen's life might have appeared quiet on the surface. No scandalous affairs, no dramatic bankruptcies, no mysterious deaths like Edgar last week. But when you look closer, you realise her story is every bit as rich, complex and compelling as the novels she left behind. This was a woman who grew up in a lively, book-filled household, who observed people with the sharpness of a modern comedian, and who understood social games so well she could dismantle them with a single line of dialogue. She wrote in a time when women weren't supposed to be novelists, let alone novelists with wit, nerve and opinions, and she still did it anyway, often in secret, hiding pages when visitors entered the room. She watched her family go through financial uncertainty. She saw how fragile a woman's security could be, and she experienced heartbreak and disappointment in her own romantic life. Yet none of it made her bitter. Instead, she turned it into art, stories full of irony, intelligence, and that very Austen blend of realism and romance. And those stories endure. Pride and Prejudice remains one of the most beloved novels in the world, with Elizabeth Bennet standing as literature's original I know my worth heroine. Sense and Sensibility gives us sisters navigating emotion and practicality with gorgeous humanity. Emma is still the blueprint for the well-meaning meddler who makes everything worse. Mansfield Park, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey, each offering a different lens on love, class, morality, and the way society shapes us. Her characters feel alive because she saw people clearly. Her romances feel earned because she understood how relationships actually grow. And her humour still lands because human absurdity, that never goes out of fashion. But perhaps most astonishing is the scale of her legacy. From blockbuster film adaptations to endless BBC series, to YouTube retellings, modern novels, academic studies, memes, merch, and entire festivals dedicated to dressing up like it's 1813, Jane's influence is everywhere. She sold millions upon millions of books, more now than she ever could have imagined, and continues to inspire readers, writers, and romantics across the world. Jane Austen once wrote that we all have a pleasant horror of being found out. Well, she's been found out as one of the funniest, sharpest, most enduring writers Britain has ever produced. And for someone who published anonymously, someone who never lived to see her name on the title page, someone who left this world far too soon, her voice feels louder than ever. Her world, full of misunderstandings, longing glances, social politics, and untimely hope, still resonates because she captured something timeless: the comedy of being human and the courage it takes to love. Jane Austen hasn't just survived, she reigns. And that is the legacy of a woman who wrote in secret, laughed at society, trusted her own genius, and gave us stories we'll return to, joyfully, repeatedly, forever. Okay guys, so that concludes our adventure into the life of Jane Austen. Thank you once again for joining me on the Author Files. I never really knew much about Jane before researching for this episode, so it's been really fascinating hearing about her life and discovering cool little facts about her. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, a star, follow the channel, head over to our Instagram where you can find us at the Author Files Podcast. Every bit of support from you really, really helps. And finally, before I go, I hope you have a very merry rest of your Christmas festivities and have a wonderful new year. And the best news is that I'll be back on the 2nd of January with the first episode of 2027, where we will be looking at the life of Charles Dickens. So stay safe, stay reading, and I'll see you in the new year. See ya!